The Eastern Carolingians are dead. Conrad the Younger, adopted heir to the royal family, has spent his time as king struggling and failing to keep the king's authority intact. His campaigns against Lotharingia for the imperial city of Aachen have failed. His reign is plagued by rebellion after rebellion. The kingdom of East Francia is not a kingdom at all, but an eternal struggle for the Duke of Franconia to force the Dukes of Saxony, Swabia, and Bavaria into submission until the day of Conrad's death. Meanwhile, Vikings pillage and prod at Germany's shores and rivers. Hamburg burns in the wake of Slavic revolts and raids. And the Magyars have come across the Carpathian Mountains to loot, burn, and enslave everything from Bavaria to Iberia. Things cannot continue this way. And they won't. My name is Alexander Hill, and welcome to the first episode of my history of the Holy Roman Empire. So, you might be wondering why I'm starting after all the Carolingians are dead for the history of the Holy Roman Empire, and you'd be right to ask that question. The way I see it, most people already know about Charlemagne generally, very generally. I can't speak for America, but generally if I ask someone, hey, do you know who Charlemagne is? They're gonna say, oh yeah. Now, maybe they don't have any actual details, but they've heard of his name. And as far as the Holy Roman Empire goes, that's saying a lot. That's a lot. I'm also not super familiar with all the Carolingian era stuff, but I do know that there's a good reason why the Carolingian Empire and what we call the Holy Roman Empire are separated into two different eras of history and are called two different things. Technically, one is a continuation of the other, and technically, according to the Pope, it's all the Holy Roman Empire. So that counts when we're saying, oh, the Holy Roman Empire lasted 1,000 years. But realistically, after the Carolingians die, that's a totally different empire you got there. As such, I'm starting with Henry the Fowler, the first king of the Germans who was not a Carolingian. If you want updates on when each episode comes out and want to know about the other projects I'm working on, it'd be real nice of you to hit that subscribe button and all the other associated algorithm buttons. Now, the story of Rome's less popular succeeding disaster empire, in a nutshell, can kind of be described with this.
And courage. The Empire. Led by the craven, torn apart by the greedy, weakened and exposed, forever on the defense. But no longer.
Summon the Elector Counts!
人はいずれ死ぬ。ならば人生には意味がないのだ。そもそも生まれてきたことに意味はなかったのか。死んだ仲間がそうなのか。あの兵士たち無意味だったのか。いや違う。あの兵士たちに意味を与えるのは我々だ。あの勇敢な死者を、哀れな死者を思うことができるのは聖者である我々だ。我々はここで死に、次の聖者に意味を託す。それこそ唯一この残酷な世界に抗う術なのだ。兵士を怒れ、兵士を叫べ、兵士を叩け。
Alternatively, if you have a more negative view on the Holy Roman Empire, you could describe it as a gang war within a gang war within another gang war, especially in 919. After the death of Conrad the Younger, it's clear to all the dukes of East Francia that something needs to change. And they weren't going to hand the crown over to a foreigner like Charles the Simple, even if he was technically the next heir to the Carolingian dynasty. Because if they did, then they'd be French. And And much like the modern German state of Saarland proves, there is no amount of suffering a man won't go through to avoid becoming French. God save the poor souls of Strasbourg. Duke Eberhard, Conrad's successor to his actual title, the Duke of Franconia, has the most qualifications for the position of any potential heirs to the throne. And by that I actually mean nepotistic connections, but it doesn't matter anyway, since the last thing Duke Eberhard wants to do is go through the same thing that his predecessor did. Because, contrary to everything you've learned from fantasy, being a king sucks ass. In 919, the crown was basically a sentence to eternal suffering. The king was expected to use everything at his disposal to somehow protect his lands, while the nobles within his borders spent everything they had to make it so the king had less stuff and just eat away at his land. For the sake of his sanity, it was better for Eberhard to just pass the crown off and see what he could get out of a deal. This brings us to our maybe a little oblivious protagonist, but less oblivious than he may seem. Henry the Fowler. Born in 876, Henry was third in line to the Ludwig line of dukes of Saxony. Back when there was just one Saxony and not three, unless you count the alternate universe spin-off happening on the island next door. As his brothers Tankmar and Ludolf died, it became pretty clear early on that Henry was going to inherit the duchy. So at the young age of, 30? Really? At the ripe old age of 30, Henry married his first wife, a nun.
You what?
Okay, technically she wasn't a nun yet. Maybe? There are some complications there. Her name was Hatteburg of Merseburg, and Henry basically went up to her as she was taking her vows, pulled some line out of his ass, and managed to bag her. I guess because he was so enticed by her beauty and the usefulness of her inherited wealth, according to Widukind, the Etonian chronicler. You can decide which one of those motives is less stupid. I've never been to Merseburg personally, which Hatteburg was heiress to, but given how events played out, I can kind of see how it would have been worth it. Plus,
Forbidden fruit, dickhole!
Still kind of a rash decision, especially since the marriage got annulled 3 years later because the church ruled that no doesn't counteract your nunly vows, and Henry, get this, forgot to ask the bishop if he could marry her.
You didn't have to cut me off!
Not to mention that Hatteburg had already given Henry a son at this point named Tankmar, so big question mark there. He married Matilda of Ringelheim later that year, a much more sane choice, whose assets, we'll say, were far more well endowed. I'm not being coy, she just had 5 counties as opposed to just the one. Although the chronicles do say that both of them were pretty hot, so take that however you will. Also, her bloodline came with a ton of clout among the Saxon nobility. Her sister was the Queen of France, so anyway, Henry's father, Otto the Illustrious, kicks the bucket, and Henry ascends to the ducal throne in 912, and is actually pretty good at his job. That said, his job is picking fights with the king and stealing land from him, so 7 years later, in 919, Henry is fixing his bird nets because he just really likes birds, and that's why he's called Henry the Fowler. He likes birds. All the important kings are have to be some amount of autistic, right? Unrelated, an entourage of messengers appears before him, bearing the crown of East Francia, telling him that it's Duke Eberhard's intention for Henry to become king. Although, okay, technically they didn't say that. They said it was Conrad's dying wish that Henry become king, even though Henry had just rebelled against him a few years ago. So probably a fake story. In fact, this whole story about Henry fixing his bird nets and haplessly getting the crown of East Francia delivered to him, that could also just all be propaganda. And I'll circle back around to that later. Regardless of whether or not that bird story is true, in May of that year, all the nobles of Saxony and Franconia gather in Fritzlar for an imperial diet. The vote is successful, and Henry is elected King of East Francia. Kind of. See, couple problems. Saxony and Franconia are half of East Francia, at best. The Bavarians and Swabians are notably absent from the Diet. The Bavarians flipped a middle finger to the rest of Germany, as is tradition, and voted their own Duke Arnulf as king, while the Swabians were kind of busy dealing with a civil war. Because again, gang war within another gang war. Regardless, saying Henry was a legitimate ascendant to the throne was a bit like saying Russia was the true successor to the Byzantine Empire. He had only half the nobles on his side, he had no claim to any previous rulers, and he was not even fully consecrated. See, Conrad, even though he was an adoptive member of the Carolingian house, and even though he had all the pomp and circumstance of a full imperial investiture, could not keep the realm together. So obviously the traditional way of doing things wasn't going to work out too well. Henry I of East Francia was crowned king without any of the formal ceremonies or church consecrations, forsaking the total dominion over his lands awarded by the church because, let's be honest, that isn't worth all that much. Henry's low-key coronation, in addition to the bird story and the dying wish story, could all have been propaganda to make the other dukes think that Henry's just a soft boy who doesn't want to assert his royal authority. Or, a lot more competently put, he wanted to broadcast an image of being first among equals, rather than vicar of Christ on earth. One of those sounds a little more down to earth than the other. Ascending to the throne while it was on fire, Henry had to get to work right out of the gate. The most pressing matter was that he needed to consolidate power with the Swabians and the Bavarians. Burkhard, Duke of Swabia, was simple to get on board. He'd spent the past few months fighting for control over his duchy and was now staring down the King of Burgundy, who was eyeing up some of his land. Not to mention that he didn't really care all that much for the Bavarian candidate for king. So when Henry showed up with his army, it didn't exactly take much convincing for Burkhard to just say bet and fall in line. To lessen the impact and to ensure a more long-term working relationship, Henry extended an offer of a friendship agreement called an amicitio. Amicitio. That's what I'm going with. It's Latin. I don't speak Latin. I speak German, Chinese, Arabic, not Latin, or any Romance languages, so I'm gonna have a rough time in South America. In this agreement, Henry legitimized Burkhard's claim to the duchy and affirmed all the ducal rights that Eberhard had over Franconia. Burkhard, in turn, had to support Henry in his military endeavors. Bavaria, on the other hand, was more ready and willing to fight, in addition to having their own anti-king. Having been part of the actual Roman Empire, and having converted to Christianity long before the Saxons did, the Bavarians saw themselves as more civilized and more fit to rule. So, for all of history, the Bavarians have always had a reason to rebel. Cheap-ass cover. So, for all of history, the Bavarians have always had an excuse to revolt. Henry attempted to attack Bavaria twice, and on his second attempt, he arrived at the gates of Regensburg, which was Bavaria's capital at the time. Rather than humiliating Arnulf and forcing a total defeat, Henry established another friendship agreement, same as the one he gave to Burkhard and Eberhard. In 921, Arnulf took the deal and acknowledged Henry as king, accepting his role as Duke of Bavaria and Henry's legal representative within the duchy. It had been 3 years since Henry ascended to the throne, and yet he managed to do what Conrad had never been able to do in his entire reign. However, in spite of the kingdom being united for the first time in a fucking while, it came at the cost of the immense independence of his dukes. But a fragile unity was better than whatever the hell they were doing before. So his eyes turned west. Henry now had to deal with the Lotharingia problem. See, Lotharingia is a weird little strip of land that was created out of the partition of Verdun in 843, which divided the Carolingian Empire into West Francia, East Francia, and Lotharingia. Lotharingia goes all the way from the modern-day Netherlands, more or less straight down, to modern-day Provence and the Mediterranean Sea. The last king of Lotharingia had died with no heirs, so Burgundy and Italy became their own kingdoms, while Lotharingia had been fought over by West Francia and East Francia. Conrad lost that war. Because the land included the imperial capital of Aachen, it was a matter of honor that Henry reclaim it from being French. Lucky for him, the West Francian king, Charles the Simple, had been faced with a rebellion. Though Henry had some peace agreements with Charles, he started to slowly eat away at Lotharingian territory rather than coming to the king's aid because, it's right there. Henry really the kind of guy to look at Lotharingia and go, is anyone gonna eat that? And then not wait for an answer. Although the French quickly pushed Henry back across the border, Henry got to keep Lotharingia in the resulting peace treaty. He signed more friendship agreements with Lotharingian nobles, including the Duke. This did a lot to integrate Lotharingia rather than allowing it to exist as a basically independent polity that just so happened to be under the rule of one of the Frankish kings. Possessing Lotharingia not only made the kingdom stronger practically, but with Aachen in Henry's hands, it more or less gave him a claim to the entirety of the Carolingian Empire. Now that Henry had secured his power at home and his legitimacy as a successor to the Carolingians, the time had come to deal with the kingdom's external threats. The Carolingian military had been mostly made up of free men who were obligated to serve as soldiers at their own expense for a particular amount of time. Because of this, soldiers tended to be poorly organized, trained, and equipped. This didn't matter all that much when the army you were fighting was similarly structured, but the Magyars were kind of different. See, the Magyars, who are the ancestors of modern-day Hungarians, as they will never stop telling you, they were one of those people groups who seemingly spawned out of the Eurasian steppe. They settled around the Carpathian Basin and, being horse lords, their entire army was made up of horse archers. Not only that, but their mounted archers wielded composite bows which could punch through the mail armor of the time. In 907, the Magyars broke open the path to Germany and other Carolingian territories as far west as northern Spain, by defeating the Duke of Bavaria at the time, and had raided into the realm 3 times during Henry's reign. While England and France were busy dealing with Vikings, by far the greatest threat to Germany were the Magyars, as the Germans could do nothing but hide in their castles. The only response they could levy was to catch the Magyars back on their way when they were burdened and slowed by their plunder. In 926, Henry managed to launch one of these attacks, capturing loot and a Magyar prince. With a hostage to negotiate with, Henry agreed to a 9-year peace in exchange for the prince and an annual tribute given by the Germans. By all accounts, it was a humiliating truce, but it bought Henry time that he desperately needed. Calling a diet in Worms, he proposed a new reform called the Burgenordnung. It's spelled as funny as it sounds. It was a plan to turn the peasant infantry into a professional, well-equipped fighting force. Out of every 9 peasants, 1 would be selected to become a professional soldier and move into a castle. From the castle, he was responsible for maintaining accommodation for the other 8 families and their animals if they needed to retreat behind the fortress's walls. The other 8 would work the land and store 1/3 of the year's harvest in the castle, the amount of grain needed at the time to resow a field and limit the damage to the following year's harvest if everything else was burned. The castles would also be hosts for courts and markets, causing castles to spring up all over Germany. Was it something the king was legally allowed to do? No. But you got any better ideas? While this reform did professionalize the military and increase the kingdom's ability to punch above its weight class, it must be said that ultimately this reform stripped most peasants' right to bear arms, turning the average resident of the kingdom into a defenseless subject reliant on a warrior class to protect them. The Burgenordnung became a part of the foundation of what we now call feudalism. Before turning his new army loose on the Magyars, Henry still had time on his treaty to put it to the test. And it's always better to measure twice and cut once. Plus, extra land's extra land. To those ends, Henry turned his army on the areas surrounding modern-day Leipzig and the modern state of Saxony, and subjugated Bohemia a year afterwards with the help of Bavaria. Side note, Henry also wanted the Spear of Destiny, believing that possession of the lance that stabbed Jesus would make him invincible, which, fair enough. To that end, he traded Basel, one of today's richest cities in the world, to the King of Burgundy in exchange for the Holy Lance. However, this Holy Lance is one of many among those from Armenia, Constantinople, Paris, and Rome who all claim that they have it. And also this one looks suspiciously a lot like an 8th century Frankish spear.
The worst trade deal ever made by any country, I think, in the world.
Holy or not, this spear looks pretty damn cool, and would eventually gain some notoriety of its own over the coming centuries. In 933, Henry believed he was ready. With his new army, United Kingdom, and the Holy Lance, he summoned the people of his kingdom. According to Widukind, he said, "Once your empire was disrupted on every side by countless dangers, but now it is free. You yourselves know this well, having labored under the grinding weight of civil conflicts and foreign wars. And now, through the grace of the highest divinity, by our own labor and by your strength, there is peace and unity. The barbarians have been defeated and subjected in service to us. There's just one thing remaining for us to do. We must join together against our common enemy, the Magyars. I have plundered you, your sons, and your daughters to fill their treasuries, and now I am forced to plunder the churches and the servants of those churches, leaving us naked and with no money. Consider among yourselves what should be done about this and choose. Should I take the treasures that were consecrated to the divine office and hand them over to purchase our redemption from the enemies of God?" His army was hungry for blood, so Henry refused to pay the Magyars and waited for them to come to his doorstep. The Slavic tribes that usually accompanied the Magyars on their raids refused to do so this year, and sent them a fat dog instead.
Right, didn't fucking think you can lay around my house all day doing fuck all. Go find a fucking job, you fucking sausage roll looking twat.
So they knew something was fishy. Upon entering Germany, the Magyars were defeated in 2 skirmishes in Thuringia. A bad start, but honor demanded that the Magyars teach the Germans to hide behind their walls like good subjects. Little did they know that the Germans didn't need the walls anymore. On March 15th, 933 AD, an army of soldiers from every corner of the kingdom met the Magyars at Riade, on the Unstrut River near Merseburg, the holding of Henry's first wife. East Francia's new foot soldiers caught the Magyar riders in a melee after the Hungarians had attempted to retreat from besieging the small town, distracting them just long enough to bring a mass of heavy cavalry down on the Magyars. While not suffering horrific losses, the shock was enough to send the Magyars back to Hungary, with their tails between their legs. That had been the first time a Frankish army had ever defeated the Magyars in open battle. In the aftermath of the Battle of Riade, they dared not raid into East Francia from then on. However, that doesn't mean that they wouldn't come to blows in the future. But for now, the Kingdom of Germany was secure for the first time in decades. Its lands were united, its people were protected, and its enemies were wary of their new military might. In the wake of their success, Henry led one last campaign north into Schleswig to remind the Vikings to keep their raids to England and France and to stay on their side of the Danweg. Just before dying of a stroke in 936, Henry made his nobles promise to break the tradition of partitioning his lands amongst his heirs, wishing for the kingdom to be handed off to his heir Otto, in its entirety, solidifying the kingdom and the later empire. Although, if you remember, there's a son older than Otto who's still alive. So as the young Otto takes the throne, safe to say the transition won't be as smooth as Henry had hoped. And there we bring to a close the story of Henry the Fowler. Or at least all that I could find about him. I hope you guys will join me next time for the story of Otto the Great, which is much more complicated, but much more fun. Because Otto the Great, unlike a lot of people named the Great, wasn't really great because he was super competent at things. He just kind of had this strategy of go south, which isn't really a strategy, but he managed to somehow conquer all of Italy with it, so there had to be something going on. And if this isn't an Alexander the Great situation where he's just really, really good on the battlefield either. He's actually kind of just average. He was just really, really lucky. But that's kind of what makes it fun. So that was Henry the Fowler. Next time, I'm going to alternate on my channel between uploads of history stuff and uploads of world building stuff, unless I feel like making 2 in a row. But yeah, next time I upload should be something world building related, but after that will be Otto the Great. And I will see you there.